Thank you, Nicholas, and your organization, your gallant organization, for inviting me to come and address you on this topic, which is self-inflicted. I generated the topic myself, and afterwards it started to intimidate me. And that meant that I had to really apply my mind to it. And so I see this opportunity as an exercise in terms of imparting intellectual ammunition to your gallant organization. And so what's going to happen is I will bring to the fore some pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, which hopefully towards the end will depict the full picture. And before I get to the nitty-gritty of the presentation, I just want to share with you my modus operandi in terms of how I go about the business of persuading people to be receptive to the classical liberal libertarian paradigm. I used to be a Marxist revolutionary, having been detained in the past solitary confinement twice and so on. At that time, around that time, I was an inveterate Marxist. I knew a great deal about Marxism and so on, and Marxism was the nirvana that I was striving towards for the country to march into. And then I underwent an ideological metamorphosis to be where I am now. That is a bare knuckle, no prisoners taken, libertarian, a classical liberal. That's another story in terms of how that had occurred. Now, I'm mentioning this because, as I have said, I want to explain briefly to you as to how I persuade people to the classical liberal paradigm. I used to, in the past, just simply impose the free market paradigm, the classical liberal paradigm, and so on. In many cases, people would be alienated because they would be saying, Temba, how can you say all these things? You know, because we used to be involved together in the context of this Marxist thought and so on. We had discussions and so on around Marxism and all that stuff and so on. And then I changed that. And to this day, this is my modus operandi. And I would say, and I still say, I would say, look, okay, so the person engages me and says to me, Temba, explain why it is that you are where you are today now with this free market foundation organization and so on, and articulating, classical liberal views and so on. They normally say liberal views and so on. And we know that the term liberal in the South African context has negative connotations. That's based on people not understanding as to what liberalism is about. So I always sometimes say classical liberalism. So then they start to think, hey, what's that now? How is it different from liberalism? But anyway, this is my modus operandi. Say, you are the person who's engaging me. And I say to you, look, remember when we were dedicated to the overthrow of apartheid and so on? Think about those times. What did we aspire to? What sort of socio-political economic order did we aspire to? Right? What did you as an individual at that time aspire to? And I said, look, if you do not agree with me, you must tell me. I would say, look, I think you and I believed in a society where you would be allowed to do as you pleased, so long as you did not hurt any of your fellow humans in the process. And so we believed that the government should not interfere with the socio-economic pursuits, and that if you wanted to set up a business, the government must not be the impediment to that. If you decided as to which school you wanted to send your children to, or which one you wanted to attend, the government should not interfere with that. And the government must not interfere with your decision in terms of where you want to live and so on and so forth. So I would explain all these things, and the response would always be, yeah, that's what I believed in. And then I say, hey, welcome, comrade liberal, gosh, where have you been all this time? And the person would say, comrade, that's exactly what classical liberalism is about. This is what libertarianism is about. Oh, really? But now the thing is, when you've engaged a person on that basis, don't rub it in, because at some point the person, because it might be intellectually traumatic for them to say at that time, oh yes, I am actually, I now subscribe, I embrace the classical liberal paradigm and so on. So you let them marinate in that, let them stew in that. You know, land it off. And then at some point, some couple of days later, a couple of weeks later, or even a couple of months later, you can revisit that with that person, just to reinforce that point. So that's been my basic modus operandi. Now, getting to the gist of my presentation, I want to share with you one of Aesop's fables. Aesop, the Greek storyteller and philosopher, with his stories, they always had a moral. Now, this is the moral of the story. Now, let me get to the story itself. This is about the horse and the stag. Aesop said there was a related story of a horse and a stag that were grazing on a rich meadow. And because the stag was equipped with the horns, when the rich meadow was getting smaller, it drove the horse out of the rich meadow. And so the horse went to seek the aid of man and said, will you help me? And man said, oh, very gladly I will do so. However, in order to maneuver you tactfully and so on, so that we can drive the stag out of this rich meadow, I have to put the bridle over your head, put a bit in your mouth, and put a saddle on top of you. The horse said, oh, yeah, no, that's fine, let's go ahead. So in a short time, the stag was driven out, and the horse said to man, now that the mission has been accomplished, could you kindly get off my back, please? And could you kindly remove the rein from my head, please? And man said, no, that's not going to happen, because you know what? I know now that I can use you for my own sake. Now, the philosopher Horatius, in the English term known as Horace, on listening to this fable, said the following words, and I quote him in English: this is the case of him who, dreading poverty, parts with that invaluable jewel, liberty. That's the moral of the story. So it is the government that's sitting on your back because you voted for the government, or by giving it a blank check in terms of saying, oh, could you do this for me, please? I come from the economically disadvantaged background, or whatever the case might be, and so on. Here's a blank check. And so the government says, okay, fine, I get the mandate from you. And the government comes up with a whole plethora of restrictive sort of rules, policies, regulations, and so on and so forth. And who's to blame for that? It is you, because you have not understood the importance of individual liberty, individual sovereignty. Now, let's get to, if the title of this talk was just simply Ideologies and Individual Sovereignty, it would be sufficient. But the reason why I've got statist here, it's to underscore a point that's very important, because this is based on the context of statist ideology. Because in the political arena, ideology will always be statist by definition. This is the importance of this. But what is ideology? This is what it is. This is from the Princeton's WordNet, which is an online dictionary, and I have looked at various definitions and so on. I cannot see, I have not encountered any definition that negates what I'm going to read out to you, which is derived from the Princeton's WordNet. What is an ideology? A set or system of theories and beliefs held by an individual or group, especially about socio-political goals and methods of group to attain them in common usage. Ideology is such a set of beliefs so strongly held by their adherents as to cause them to ignore evidence against such beliefs and thus fall into error. In this sense, it is viewed as a negative trait contrasted by pragmatism and distinct from idealism. And dear Raphael, in his or her essay, I'm not sure as to whether it's a woman or a man, that is entitled Problems of Political Philosophy, published in 1970, said it is a prescriptive doctrine that is not supported by rational argument. So ideology is pursued and implemented regardless of the outcomes, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the policies. That is an important part of the definition as to what an ideology is. And then something that's also important about an ideology is that statist ideology means that it is prescriptive. It prescribes as to what ought to happen, what policies ought to be enacted based on that embraced ideology. It is prescriptive. It is also coercive because it does not tolerate, will not accommodate any recalcitrant tendencies. And so the ideology is pursued with unaccommodating vigor, and it does not accommodate any dissenting sort of tendencies whatsoever, as I have said. And so in a way, it is a situation where the end justifies all means. All means. So whatever means the state might resort to, that is acceptable in terms of the paradigm. No, it's not a paradigm in terms of the ideology that is being pursued and implemented. Now, I would cite a couple of cases where one can see this trend in terms of statist ideology. And the important thing to bear in mind is that all ideologies, statist ideologies, when they are implemented, they have a tendency, generally and universally, of restricting individual rights, individual sovereignty. We'll come to the definition of that later. We'll look at socialism, communism, and this is what Karl Marx said. The theory of communism may be summed up in one sentence: abolish all private property. So that means you as an individual having your own property, that will be abolished. It will be put an end to if, say, socialism and communism were to be implemented. And so that would impact on your individual personal sovereignty, on your rights. That is what would happen. Because at the end of the day, communism, socialism is ownership or control over the means of production, economic production that is, and which explains why the whole thing about a statist ideology, remember I've mentioned that it is implemented, any ideology is implemented irrespective of the consequences, right? And that it does not accommodate any individual tendencies whatsoever. And so which is why you had people like Lenin saying, we are breaking eggs in order to make an omelette. And with that, millions, thousands of people dying. And it was also Stalin who had said, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And these were people who were implementing the statist, socialistic ideology. Now, they're not the only culprits. We can talk about fascism, and then we know what happened when fascism was implemented in Germany, and that being extended to adjoining countries. And another culprit is the welfare state, the redistributive welfare state. I know that for quite a time, and this continues to be the case, that Sweden has been paraded on the global stage as the paragon of a welfare state. Now, the welfare state, in essence, means that Peter is being robbed in order to pay Paul. The more productive sector of the economy, of the population, they're the ones who are being robbed in order to expedite the whole process of redistributing the fruits of their labor. So that gets sent to people like me who are congenital jackasses. If I don't work, it doesn't matter, the state will take care of me and so on. And you, the productive citizen of the country, you pay for that. That defines generally what what this state welfare means. It is ideologically driven. So it is implemented, whatever the costs might be, whatever the implications might be, because one of the implications of that is that because you are being punished, penalized for being economically productive, that tends to have a disincentive. It acts as a disincentive. It contributes to you being disillusioned with the country because now you are being productive and you're being penalized for it. So it becomes very demotivating, and hence in welfare, state welfare-oriented countries, there's always a flight of capital to other countries. There is no shortage of culprits. There is the developmental state ideology, for example, that the government in South Africa has been talking about. And what that means is that when they talk about it, and when I've studied as to what this concept means, this ideology means, and I've looked at various papers and various books and so on, basically they talk about the state management of the macroeconomy, right? Macroeconomic management of the state, but it extends the tentacles also to the level of microeconomics, right? Where you are hit with all sorts of regulations that interfere with the spirit of enterprise, right? With your business and so on. And so this again is an ideology. It is ideological status ideology that is pursued irrespective of the consequences. And here we've seen in South Africa the chickens have come home to roost. We've seen that because this ideology being pursued the way it has been, the effects we have come home to roost. We have an unemployment rate in this country of about 40%. If one takes into consideration, as you know, the fact that there are a couple of people, many millions, who have become disillusioned and are no longer looking for work. They've given up because there is no prospect of them getting any jobs whatsoever. So that's another culprit. And then we have affirmative action. Now, affirmative action, in terms of the definition, is an ideology, right? It is pursued on the same basis as any other ideological inclinations. And here, it does not matter what the consequences are, and those protagonists of affirmative action policies are bent on pursuing this irrespective of what happens. For instance, if you confront them with empirical evidence, and you say, look, let's look at a country that has had the longest period of affirmative action policies being implemented. We look at the results as to what has happened. And you say, for example, let us look at the United States. And there, with affirmative action policies, you're looking at a situation where now the situation is that if you look at where the intended beneficiaries of affirmative action policies are now socioeconomically, which means black Americans, African Americans, as they choose to call themselves these days, they occupy the lowest rung of the socioeconomic ladder. And who is up there? It is the Japanese Americans. How does one explain the fact that despite decades of affirmative action policies being implemented in order to benefit the black Americans, why is it that they are down there? It must tell you something, and that something is that there is something seriously, fundamentally amiss about the principle of affirmative action as implemented. That's what it means. And you look at the Japanese up there, Japanese Americans up there, and other Asiatic groups. How does one explain the discrepancy between that group there and the group that occupies the lowest rung of the economy, socioeconomic ladder in the US. How does one explain this discrepancy? Because the Japanese Americans never benefited from any affirmative action policies. Instead, their history in the US has had some negative things happening to it. I won't go into that, it might take my time, but very briefly what I can say is the Japanese, when I think it was President Roosevelt who had enacted an executive order in terms of which Japanese Americans were to be moved from California to a place in, I think it's Kansas, and there had been no compensation for them. And they had to sell properties, businesses within short periods of time and at sometimes just confiscatory sort of prices. And they were housed, accommodated in areas, and according to Thomas Sowell, he said they've been moved to areas in Arkansas where nobody had lived before and nobody has lived since. So ablution facilities, living in hostels and all of that stuff. At the end of the Second World War, right, this was against the suspicion of the yellow peril in America at that time during the Second World War. So at the end of the Second World War, when they were allowed to operate normally like with everybody else, there had been no compensation whatsoever. And so they pulled themselves up to get to where they are today. And so Jesse Jackson and the other Reverend Jesse Jackson and the others, they still believe in affirmative action, still pursue this, despite all this evidence that you throw at them. And that means that they are ideologically locked into this ideology. This is one of the bad things about this is one culprit. Then there's another culprit. And this is this whole, I call it the fetish of income inequality. Now, this is has been gaining currency within the political circles, especially those people in government. And you hear the unions and just about everybody talking about, we must bridge the income gap and all of that stuff and all of that nonsense. So now, and the thing is, I can say one or two things or three things just to torpedo this nonsensical concept of trying to bring about income inequality. First of all, let me use the example of Adedayo Thomas. He's one of your colleagues. Adedayo said, if I were, let's say I'm Adedayo, I give each one of you in this room the same amount of money. It might be $50,000 or rands or whatever monetary denomination, so on, and you have nothing else other than that. And I say to you now, embark on your own personal individual initiatives, do whatever you please with that money and so on. Now, you have nothing else, no cars, nothing else, no home, but you have this amount of money, handsome amount of money, or maybe it might be $100,000 or $50,000, whatever monetary denomination. Now, I revisit you after about 5 years. Adedayo says, you will find that some of you will have used up all that money, and some of you will have bought a house or whatever, and some of you have instead opted for a car and living in the car, and some few of you will have invested that money in some kind of business. These would be the more entrepreneurially oriented people. And so these would be the people who would be creating wealth, and the money would grow over time and so on. Now, but the point is, would you, having started out on an income equal basis, would you now be at the same level? No, not at all. Because why? Now I come in. Because why? Because we are all different people. We are differently endowed, and we have our own personal, individual choices and preferences and so on. We prioritize differently. What is of value to me might not be of value to another person. We're different, and this is what explains essentially the income inequalities that we find, amongst ourselves or in any community whatsoever. Now, the point is, elaborating on this further, if you were to ask, if you were to check, oh, okay. Thomas Piketty advocates that there should be implemented a wealth tax that's going to reduce the incomes of those few who are filthy rich. He doesn't use that term filthy rich, but something that's on the same par, has the same connotation. So he says that. Now the point is, I ask myself as Temba Nolutshungu, okay, the rich people, where is their money? Their money is in the banks, their money is out there invested in some businesses and so on. It's not under the pillow, it is not buried in the garden, it is not in their pockets, it is there, it is generating wealth because the banks lend the money out to businesses and those businesses employ other people, the money is out there, it grows the economy. That's where the money is. And I look at some of the richest people in the world, and I look at Oppenheimer, I look at somebody like Johann Rupert, I look at many other people that I respect so much for having generated so much wealth in the process, creating so many jobs. And I say to myself, okay, yeah, Temba Nolutshungu, your lifestyle, how does it compare with them? Well, I think I live a better, more content lifestyle than any of the rich people. I love my meat, and I love my filet mignon. I have my braai vlees every time, and so some of them might be vegetarians, and really have to endure what they're eating, or green stuff, that's normally eaten by rabbits and so on, and the thing is, I have one car, right? And say Nicky Oppenheimer or any of these other guys who are rich, and they might have something like 8 cars. But the thing is, they don't drive those same cars simultaneously. So it's like they have one car at a time. So they're in the same situation as I am with just one car. So all this stuff, or this rage against rich people that have to be penalized in terms of exorbitant taxes, it is born out covetousness and envy. That's the bottom line. That is the bottom line. That is what explains it. And so, Thomas Piketty, he has learned his lesson, his idea from his great master, that is Karl Marx. Because Karl Marx had said, the surest way to destroy capitalism is by taxes, taxes, and more taxes. So you have that same sentiment running from Karl Marx right through the Thomas Piketty thesis. And so people who espouse, who advocate that this should be adopted as a matter of policy, and that is to address the income disparities, income imbalances, they are ideologues. They are statist ideologues. They don't care whatever evidence you throw at them. Now, the worst form of inequality is to make unequal things equal. Can somebody venture a guess as to when this was mentioned, who had uttered these words? When, in terms of when these words were uttered, can you, was it this year, maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Wait, if you know the answer, just wait. Just a guess. A wild guess.
500. It was a few seconds ago.
Identify who it was, I would guess the 80s.
It was by somebody by the name of Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, who lived between 384 and 322 BC. The worst form of inequality is to make unequal things equal. He said this then. Now, one last culprit in terms of statist ideologies is dirigism. That is, you believe in a regulated economy, a regulated society, you are dirigist in terms of your ideological outlook and so on. Now, people who are dirigists, that is essentially people who are bureaucratic, who see a solution to any problem as just throwing more regulations, more control mechanisms on the society at large, not only within the economic arena. Those people do not see that as just simply a means to an end. It becomes an end in itself. And so it proves that a particular regulation or policy is proving to be counterproductive or not achieving the goals as stated in the policy document. No, they go ahead. They go ahead and come up with more regulatory interruptions, interferences, impediments, and so on. It goes on ad infinitum. And so it is ideologically pursued with the same ideological intellectual zeal as with all these other statist ideological culprits that I have mentioned. Now, Leon Lowe, my colleague, at some stage when we had a discussion, he had said, you know, regulations do not actually regulate the product. It's like, for example, with liquor or with smoking regulations, tobacco regulations. It is not the product that is being regulated. It is the people who are regulated. It is the people, not the product that is regulated. And so, for example, can you imagine any of the policy enforcement agencies, or maybe call them the inspectors, they come to your liquor store and they come past you. Oh, you're the owner. Oh, yes, you're well looking for that product there, you know, that you're regulating and so on. No, they don't go to the shelves and say, hey, these are the products that are offending, you know, that we need to regulate. No, they regulate you because they say you have infringed the law, it's what you've done, and so on and so forth and so on. It is not the product that is regulated. It is the people who are regulated, be it in an individual or corporate context. It is the people, not the product, that is regulated. Now, there's a whole list of other statist ideological tendencies that I could dwell upon and comment on, but I think at this juncture I should now share with you what the thinking is, what the underlying principles are, and what the consequences are of implementing policies that are informed by the principle of individual sovereignty. And before we do that, let us try to understand as to what individual sovereignty means. And I know some of us have a basic idea, and some of us have an even better idea than my understanding as to what individual sovereignty is before I embarked on research around this issue. Individual sovereignty, that is self-ownership, is the concept of property in one's own person expressed as the moral or natural right of a person to have bodily integrity and be the exclusive controller of his body and life. This is from Wikipedia. Then, this is from John Stuart Mill, and for me, this is the one that really does justice to the concept because it is pregnant with just about everything around the principle of individual sovereignty. Now, John Stuart Mill, who English philosopher, 1805, born then and died in 1873. This is what he said, and I quote, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Over himself, over his body and mind, the individual is sovereign in the part which merely concerns himself. His independence is of right, absolute." This is what individual sovereignty is. This is why it is so threatening to those people who believe in big government. This is what is threatening to those people who embark and implement policies that stifle individual freedom. This is what is so threatening, because just this, what I've just read out to you, means that this, when you talk about individual sovereignty, that is the moral high ground. It is the moral high ground when you talk about individual sovereignty, and the government doesn't like that, you know. And so if you contrast that with big government's agenda, which ought to be limited government, you will find that the government occupies a lower, the lower moral ground, by far the lowest, in fact the deeper moral ground, not moral high ground. And so the government is not the cure. The government is the disease, as somebody said, right? The government is a necessary evil, and that means the government has to be kept on a short leash. And the government has to, if it really wants to deliver the greatest good of an expedited process whereby people can achieve the greatest goods accruing to themselves through their own individual personal endeavors, the government should get the hell off the back of people as individuals, and things will happen. You know, that is what needs to happen. Now, we know that all these ideologically oriented policy directions have proved to be disastrous. They have been discredited. There is empirical evidence that abounds everywhere. I needn't go into that. And the point is now, if we focus on just the idea as a point of departure of individual sovereignty, in the economic arena, if we are talking about free markets, we are talking about economic freedom, we are talking at the center of which there is individual sovereignty. And it means that in terms of the free market economic freedom paradigm, and that is informed by individual sovereignty, people are allowed to do as they please so long as whatever socio-economic interactions are entailed with other people do not entail force or fraud. So you're free to do whatever you want to do, so long as your initiatives do not entail force or fraud. In other words, do not harm other people. That's what the free market is about. And so the government should allow people, that means the individual at the end of the day. When we talk about people, we are talking about the fact that you look at a group, you talk about people, you are essentially talking about the component parts of that entity. That means the individuals. And so if your policies are focused on the individuals, that means individual sovereignty, you are going to find that you are on the right path in terms of us in this country with the challenges that confront us socioeconomically, that we will find that we're getting somewhere there. And we would be able to deliver high economic growth rates of about 10%. When you grow at 10%, the economy doubles in just over seven years. Incomes double in just over 7 years. And if the economy grows, let's say at a modest, relatively speaking, 8%, the incomes double in 9 years. So that is feasible, that can be reached. But the point is, how do we get there? As I've said, we get there by embarking on policies as a point of departure that are informed by individual sovereignty. And so the individual, in their individual or corporate context, say the companies, those involved in the economic arena, the government in terms of policies that it implements, their policies ought to protect private property. Those policies ought to respect the freedom of choice of individuals and involved in their entrepreneurial activities or in their individual personal contexts. And those policies government should respect that there should be freedom of competition, because people are competitive. From competition, you get excellence. Excellence is a consequence of competition in whatever sphere of human endeavor. Sporting activities or whatever. You will find that where you have competition, that you get excellence. you get good athletes, you get good teams, and so it's all from competition. Competition is a natural condition of human life, of human nature. It is. People are competitive. You even compete with yourselves in a sense, in that you might say, okay, yesterday I was using a bicycle, but now I need to actually move one level up and maybe invest in a motorcycle, and then after some time you say, okay, maybe a car, maybe a so on. So you yourself are never content with your prevailing current socio-economic circumstances. So you look at them critically, you say to yourself, how can I improve myself on this? And this is the stuff that human progress is made of. And this is what the governments, all governments throughout the world tend to miss out on big time. Now, Gandhi knits it all together. And I'm going to quote him. Born in 1869, died in 1948, many of us will know that. He said, I look upon an increase of the power of the state with the greatest fear, because while apparently doing good by minimizing exploitation, it does the greatest harm to mankind by destroying individuality, which lies at the root of all progress. This is Mahatma Gandhi. This is what he said. This is very, very, very important for us to understand. Now, somebody said, this was Horus 65 to 8 BC, he lived then. He will always be a slave who does not know how to live upon a little. Now, sometimes, because some of us are covetous, some of us are envious, and we prevail on our political parties to address the situation, so and give them a blank check, which is what I said before. And the governments run with that. Because politicians like to say, look, we are interested in the interests of the neediest amongst us. And they will talk about the poorest of the poor, which term I hate now these days because it is so undermining. You know, can you imagine if I went out and I could tell who people from their appearance were the poor, were going through hard times, and I said, I'm looking for the poorest of the poor. Oh, you look like the poorest of the poor, and so on. You know, it would be so insulting. And poor people don't like to be reminded all the time that they are poor people. I never talk about poor people, except in cases where I can't think of some other term, but then I qualify that, you know. So politicians like to say, okay, we're going to address the needs or interests of the poor and so on. And that invites a heavy-handed government that comes up with all these prescriptive policies that cause so many problems for so many people. And so, coming towards the end, what I'd like to say is, by way of summing up, looking at this country and looking at the fact that it is so bent on implementing this ideology, which is socialist oriented in some aspects, but essentially statist and developmental in terms of the ideology that motivates it. We're not going to get anywhere. Things are going to get worse. And you've seen in countries that have embraced some of these statist ideologies that the chickens are coming home to roost. And you look at a country like China, for example, and you look at the areas where they have implemented some of the most radical free market-oriented reforms. You look at the fact that just those policies implemented in those areas, now China has become the second biggest economy in the world, you know, in just the shortest possible time. And thanks to Deng Xiaoping with communists like these who needs free marketeers, you know, he was instrumental in getting all these reforms to be implemented that are so radically free market oriented, and that account for the fact that China is where it is today, socio-economically. It is. With these policies, according to the World Bank, over 500 million people have been uplifted from poverty within decades. These policies were implemented in 1978, from 1978 onwards. And now, over 500 million people who are economically destitute have been uplifted from poverty. And so it is a question of policy. It's not a question of destiny. It's not a matter of destiny that we in South Africa, we are confronted with a situation as it prevails at the moment. And the thing is, if we continue on this path, and I think we're still going to continue in this path, and I think 2019 might be a different story altogether. But if you look at the trajectory of all the policies that we're looking at right now, you can be sure what's going to happen. In the words of Thomas Hobbes, and I quote him, life will be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. On that note, I end my presentation.
Thank you for giving the talk. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Yes, I'm interested to know, you began your speech talking about how you like to sell the idea of liberty to other people. So, you know, obviously during apartheid, the main struggle against apartheid was on the left. So I'm interested to know, I know yourself and Jan Low was also a Marxist. Are there any other, you know, intellectuals, academics in South Africa today who were previously on that side of the political spectrum but have now changed their mind?
So the question is?
The question is, are there any
academics who have changed their mind. Yeah, okay. The response to that will be much more broadly and less direct. But here is what I stand on this. Now, intellectuals, academics, do not like the free market paradigm. They do not like that. Because the free market paradigm in the economic arena, which means classical liberalism, means that the ordinary man and woman does not need to be told as to what they should do in order to uplift themselves and realize their socioeconomic aspirations. A free market means that you are free to do as you please so long as you do not hurt any other person. It means that the government, all the government needs to do is to remove unnecessary, artificial, legislative and regulatory barriers to entry. So then you can move easily and go into business, which is why, you know, at the micro level, you see some people operating from spaza shops. You see some people wheeling about wheelbarrows with all sorts of goods that they want to sell and so on. That's not being informed by intellectuals, by academics and so on. So the free market nullifies the role of the academics, of the intellectuals out there, because it is the best socio-economic arrangement, let me call it, it's a spontaneous order, that allows people, especially people who are disadvantaged in many, many ways, to get somewhere from where they are and embark on the road to addressing their socio-economic needs and aspirations. That explains why the academia and also the intellectuals generally do not relate to the free market. They do not like to hear about classical liberalism because it says, no, you don't have to be involved in this because it does not allow any prescriptive sort of solutions and so on. People left to their own devices, they know best how to go about pursuing their socio-economic agendas. And they know best because they themselves know best what their subjective priorities are. They know best, and the intellectuals and the academics know nothing at all in terms of those various diverse pursuits of individuals from all walks of life and so on. And that explains the fact that many intellectuals, many academics tend to be critical of the free market, of classical liberalism. That is why we have, based at the Wits University, an institution, I can't remember what it's called, when Leon and I did the presentation to them, that's been very vociferous in terms of promoting the idea of a national minimum wage. Yes, a national minimum wage. Oh, now we intellectuals, we know that this is needed for the people because people cannot uplift themselves, and so they button themselves up. We've got the solution and so on. And then you hit them with what some people have said. I think it was Joan Robinson or Robbins or whatever, the name was, who said, what is worse? What is worse than being exploited by a capitalist is not her exact words, is not being exploited at all. If you're not exploited, you can't put bread on the table. That's it. And the wolf at the door comes right through. You're not able to put food on the table. So that's what she said. Though later on she changed, her mind around that, and was for a national minimum wage. And that's normally political opportunism that explains that. Now politicians like that. So you have these bad fellows now between the academia and the policymakers and so on, and they agree around something for which the empirical evidence speaks loudly and says, no, don't do this. Right, don't do this, because if you implement a national minimum wage, especially national minimum wage, that means the people who are going to be disadvantaged will be the people who are young because they are underskilled or don't have any skills whatsoever, and they will be the first people to go and the last people to be hired. You hit them with that, and the point is you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to get anywhere. That's because, I'm sorry, that's a broad sort of response to the question that you're asking, and I thought I should bring other things in.
Temba, thank you for your talk. I'm interested in this idea that many Marxists, many people who self-describe as Marxists, come around to classical liberalism and libertarianism. It's not an uncommon pathway, intellectual pathway that people take, and I think possibly one of the explanations could be that it's people who recognize systemic injustice and have a desire to see it rectified, and they perhaps embark on the wrong path of that discovery. But if they're honest about that pursuit, they should end up in a classical liberal direction. And so my question / comment is to say we have a lot of Marxian collectivist thinking in South Africa across all race groups, all segments of the economy and of society. But in a way, it's partly because people are seeking hard for justice, and does that give you some optimism that minds can change if we adopt the right strategy of convincing people?
Yeah, okay, let me respond in this fashion. If you went to the townships and you unleashed yourselves about the have-nots, so to speak, and you said to them, hey, there is a solution for your situation, that's going to contribute to you being socioeconomically uplifted from the level of destitution to that of being happy with your circumstances or rich or whatever, but it would not be equal and so on. They would not know what you were talking about. If you say, oh, that's a socialism that we're talking about, they would not know what you're talking about. Now the thing is, who are the people who are espousing these socialistic ideas, Marxist ideas, and actually talking quite explicitly? It is more the intellectually so-called sophisticated few. It is just those few people, it is just those few organizations, right, that espouse those ideas. Now, they thrive on the basis of people not knowing as to what their ideological package is and its consequences. And so people are sufficient to just, imbibe all those slogans. No, we are we are taking care of the have-nots here. Yeah, we are taking care of the have-nots. When they say that, and I engage them and say, look, the thing is, yeah, they have nots. What have they not? You know, what do you mean, what have they not? No, tell me, what have they not? Yeah, and I can tell you that the haves, about some of the things that the haves have. What some of the haves, many of the haves have bonds on their houses. Ooh. They have taken out loans on cars and things that they are paying off. It's not hard assets, and so on. Those are the haves and so on. But tell me more about the have-nots. Well, start scratching their heads now and so on. And in most cases, they do not come up with anything that is quite detailed in terms of how they get to characterize and define that category that they define as the have-nots. Now the thing is, those who believe in Marxism and advocate Marxism, socialism, they are people who psychologically feel that they own an intellectual space where they feel that their egos are boosted. Right? With Marxism, first let me tell you about the materialist conception of history. Otherwise, it's known as historical materialism. Wow. And they're moving around like this, you know. And by the way, you know, there is this alienation thing. You know, people are alienated from labor, people are alienated from this, that, and the other, and so on. It boosts the psychological, intellectual arrogance and ego. That's what it does. And that is why you find that the universities have this sector of students, of lecturers, that will never, ever change from a Marxist outlook to that respects individual sovereignty, and say they will never. It also takes a certain degree, a certain caliber of moral strength to say, you know, I wrote a thesis on socialism that is socialist inspired or whatever and so on, maybe on alienation, whatever and so on. For them to say, you know, I had it wrong. You know, I had it wrong. Now, I had the integrity. I'll be upfront about this. And the audacity, the moral audacity to say, Temba, you've had it so disastrously wrong. And I've accepted that. And my mind has been opened. I've said to myself, Temba, you know, this is how you shortchange yourself intellectually. You were critical of a system, capitalism, that you had not really studied or got yourself to be acquainted with. You've been reading all this Marxist literature and so on. And Temba, there was a situation that was confronting you that ought to have got you to start scratching your head. And this was the fact that over the years, before the collapse of communism, starting from 1989, there were people from all walks of life who were desperate to get from socialist countries to the so-called Western countries, capitalist countries, where people were being exploited and so on. Temba, there was the reality. You did not comprehend that. It was people from all walks of life. There was the Berlin Wall that had been erected by the so-called German Democratic Republic, that was preventing people from that side going over to the other side. Same people, same culture, and so on. They had to do that. And say to myself, gosh, Temba, you've been so really naive. You've done such an intellectual injustice to yourself. And I had the integrity and the moral audacity to say, you've had it wrong. And now you know what needs to be done, and what needs to be done is part of the work that I do. It's sort of explaining. You see, with individual sovereignty, with the free markets, with the broad classical liberalism school of thought, the persuasion, all you need to do is to explain. What you need to do is to explain explain it. You don't impose it on people. You explain how it works, and you say, if you have this, this paradigm informing policies, the government would be on a short leash, and the government would mean limited government, and part of, there are the principles that really reinforce individual liberty, individual sovereignty, and these are the principles of separation of powers. These are the principles of a fiercely independent judiciary. These are the principles of limited government, and government does best when it does the least. Right? That's the underlying principle there. These are the principles of justice around the individual. These are the principles of not infringing on the individual sovereign territory of humans, so long as whatever they do does not do any harm to their fellow humans. And so, a long story to explain to you, what you've just asked. The situation is, I do not think we're going to have a situation where you're going to get any of the intellectuals, any of the academics undergoing that ideological metamorphosis, so to speak. And the point is, this is very important for us, being classical liberals and being people who believe in free markets, being people who believe in the concept of individual sovereignty, that we always remember in pursuit of the work that we do, that we always emphasize, underscore this very, very important point of individual sovereignty. This is very, 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 very important. We explain it, and so you do not impose anything on a person. And the way you go about, advocating this as a principle is to say to people, ask them the questions that I started off by asking. What do you like? What kind of socio-economic arrangement do you want to live in that will be conducive to you thriving, flourishing? That's the question. Tell me. Now the person cannot be forthright with the answers. You embark on the basis such as I've explained. Oh, do you want to live in a society where the government tells you where you should live, what sort of work you should do, or where you should work, and who you should associate with? And do you want to live in a society, a community, in a country where the government knows best what is good for you, and you do not know what is best for yourself, despite the fact that you are the best person to know as to what your aspirations are, what things are important to you, what are your interests, what your tastes are, what therefore your choices ought to be in pursuit of your socio-economic aspirations and so on. What kind of society? You will find that in virtually all cases, the answers will be answers that will be compatible with a classical liberal paradigm that is centered around individual sovereignty. For me, this is how I normally pursue my work. So what you try to do is to demystify things. And one of the things that you explain in the process is, if you look at the concept, you tell me when I should stop. If you look at the state, at the government, you try to demystify the government. A government consists of people like you and me, who act in their own self-interest, in terms of human nature. Every person is able to define their own choices, their own preferences, and their own priorities as themselves. Ray Peary, the other day, I had him on the radio, after he had died and so on, posthumously. Anyway, what he was saying was, look, when I write music, I write it for myself. I don't think about the people out there, because it is important for me that what I write satisfies me before I satisfy people out there. Right. That is what Ray Peary was saying. right? So that statement is pregnant with this meaning that you as an individual, you know best what is good for yourself, and that when you operate on the basis of pursuing what is informed by your self-interest, you are going to get somewhere. Yeah. No, so you are Lionel Messi, you play soccer, you want to be the best soccer playing person in the world, you know, and then in the process you rake in these millions, right? These millions that Thomas Piketty says if you know, they need to help you with, and so on, right? And you look, the thing is, the beauty of a free market is this, you know, you make money by pleasing your fellow men. If you displease your fellow men, your fellow humans, you're not going to make money. You can look at somebody like, who is this comedian, South African comedian who operates now in the US? Trevor Noah. Yeah, Trevor Noah. Trevor Noah makes a lot of money. On the basis of what? On the basis of pleasing his fellow humans. So he becomes very rich. And so there was once upon a time Muhammad Ali, who made a lot of money by doing what? By beating up his opponents. And in the process getting millions. There was also a Michael Jackson who raked in millions, now, and still is raking in millions posthumously. And on the basis of what? Of just singing. Now, if I, at the time with Michael Jackson, and I was saying, look, I'm going to sing and compete against Michael Jackson, I doubt if I charged R1 for a concert for people to come and hear me sing, that people would come and actually pay that R1 to come in. Because I'd be displeasing to the ears of the people who are music lovers. And so the beauty of a free market is, while pursuing your self-interest, and you are pursuing your socioeconomic aspirations, you're pursuing profits, which is not a 4-letter word, technically it's a 6-letter word, which is such a wonderful word that everybody should internalize, that in pursuit of that, you have to please your fellow men and not displease them like Temba would do if you were to compete against Michael Jackson or Trevor Noah.